The new Endfield story chapter is actually really good, and that's exactly why it worries me. Tang Tang's story is emotional, well written, and honestly one of the strongest character arcs the game has delivered so far. The themes are clear, the emotional stakes are strong, and the character development feels meaningful in a way that a lot of gacha stories struggle to achieve. But when I finished the chapter, I found myself feeling something strange. Not excitement about the direction of the main story, not even curiosity about what happens next. Instead, I felt a little worried, which is a strange reaction to have after finishing a story that is, on its own, genuinely good. Because the problem isn't the quality of the episode itself. If anything, the episode works almost too well as a character story. Tang Tang's arc, the conflict surrounding her brother, and the themes of revenge and responsibility all come together into a narrative that feels complete. It's emotional, it's engaging, and it's exactly the kind of storytelling that Enfield has shown it can do very well. But at the same time, something about it feels disconnected from the larger story. Even though the chapter technically ties into the main antagonists, their presence in the narrative feels surprisingly small. They trigger the events that start the conflict, but after that they almost disappear from the story. The emotional drama plays out almost entirely between the characters themselves, and because of that, the chapter ends up feeling less like a major step in the main narrative and more like a self-contained episode that just happens to take place in the same world. And that's where my concern begins, because this isn't just about one chapter, it reveals something interesting about the way Endfield tells its story. The game clearly has very strong character writing, but the connection between those character stories and the larger narrative still feels surprisingly weak. And if that imbalance continues, it could become a real problem for the main story going forward. So in this video, I want to talk about why Tang Tang's story works so well, why it feels strangely disconnected from the larger narrative, and why that combination makes me a little worried about the future of Enfield's main story. If we look at this chapter purely as a character story, it works extremely well. At the center of the narrative is Tang Tang and the complicated story surrounding her brother. What initially looks like a simple revenge story gradually revealed itself to be something much more layered. For years, Tang Tang believed that her brother had moved on from the past. The desire for revenge that once defined his life seemed to have faded. He appeared to have accepted what happened and chosen to move forward. But as the story unfolds, we slowly learn that this wasn't entirely true. He never truly abandoned that desire. Instead, he simply carried it quietly in the background, and that revelation reframes a lot of his actions. It reveals that the version of him Tang Tang believed in wasn't completely real. He had been hiding an important part of himself for years, not because he didn't trust her, but because the path he chose was something he didn't want her to follow. That creates one of the strongest emotional conflicts in the story. Tang Tang isn't just dealing with grief, she's also forced to confront the fact that someone she trusted deeply has been living a double life in a way. Her brother has been pursuing revenge behind the scenes while allowing her to believe that he had moved on. And by the time the truth becomes clear, it's already too late. His action ultimately led to his death, which leaves Tang Tang with the consequences of everything that happened. That's where the story shifts from being a revenge story into something else entirely, because now the question isn't about whether revenge will happen, the question is about what Tang Tang does with the responsibility that has been left behind. She has to decide how she wants to move forward after learning the truth about her brother, and that decision becomes the emotional core of the episode. Instead of simply repeating the cycle of revenge, the story focuses on the weight of that legacy. What it means to inherit someone else's unfinished story, and to carry the consequences of choices that weren't entirely yours. And that's what makes the chapter work so well. It's not just about action or plot developments, it's about grief, responsibility, and the complicated ways people deal with loss. Those themes give the story a really emotional weight that it's sometimes difficult to achieve in long-running live service narratives. In many ways, this kind of character-focused storytelling has become one of Enfield's biggest strengths. Those themes give the story a real emotional weight that it's sometimes difficult to achieve in long-running live service narratives. In many ways, this kind of character-focused storytelling has become one of Enfield's biggest strengths. We've seen similar things before with other characters. Stories like the arc involving Leviathan or Yvonne also worked because they focused heavily on the personal conflicts of the characters involved. They gave the story emotional stakes that went beyond the larger political or factional conflicts happening in the background, and Tang Tang's story fits very naturally in that pattern. It's a strong character narrative with clear emotional themes and a meaningful arc for the characters at its center. But this is also where the strange part of the chapter begins to appear, because even though this story technically connects to the main plot, it doesn't really feel like it does. Now, technically speaking, this chapter is connected to the main story. The events that led to Tang Tang's tragedy weren't purely accidental. They were set in motion by the main antagonists operating behind the scenes. They were the ones who nudged Tang Tang's brother back towards the path of revenge. They manipulated the situation. They pushed the first domino that ultimately led to everything that happened in this chapter. So on paper, the connection to the main plot is very clear. This entire conflict exists because of the larger forces operating in the background of the story. But when you actually experience the chapter, that connection doesn't feel nearly as strong as it should. And the reason for that is actually surprisingly simple. The antagonists barely feel present in the story itself. Their influence is acknowledged, but their role in the actual events feel incredibly distant. It's almost like they appear at the very beginning of the chain of events and then disappear while everything else plays out. The emotional drama that drives the episode happens almost entirely between Tang Tang and the people directly involved in her life. Her brother's choices, the consequences of those choices, the emotional aftermath she has to deal with. All of those elements are deeply personal and character focused, and because the story spends so much time exploring those emotional dynamics, the larger antagonist force behind the conflict starts to fade into the background, which creates a very strange narrative effect. The story is clearly connected to the main plot in terms of cause and effect, but emotionally it feels almost completely separate. The antagonists don't feel like active participants in the conflict. They feel more like distant observers who happen to push events in a certain direction. And because of that, the chapter ends up feeling less like a major step forward in the central narrative and more like a self-contained character episode that simply happens inside the same world. You could almost remove the antagonist from the story entirely and the emotional arc of the chapter could still function almost exactly the same. And that's the part that started to worry me, because this kind of narrative structure raises an important question. If the main antagonist can influence events without ever feeling like they truly matter in the moment, then how much weight does the larger conflict of the story actually carry? When I started thinking about why this chapter felt so strange, I realized that this isn't actually the first time Enfield's story has done something like this. In fact, it seems to be part of a broader pattern in how the game structures its narrative. Enfield's story often feels like it's swinging between two different storytelling approaches. On one side, you have chapters that lean heavily into plot-driven storytelling. These are the parts of the narrative that focus on the larger conflict of the world, the faction involved, the mysterious antagonists operating behind the scenes, the long-term plans that are slowly unfolding across multiple chapters. Those sections are clearly trying to build the central storyline of the game, but at the same time those plot-heavy chapters often feel a bit emotionally distant. The characters are present, but they aren't always the primary focus of the story. The narrative becomes more focused on explaining what's happening in the world than on exploring the personal stakes of the characters. Then you have the opposite extreme. Chapters like this one that leans heavily into character-driven storytelling. Here the focus shifts almost entirely towards personal conflicts, the emotional relationships between characters, the consequences of individual choices. And when Enfield tells stories this way, the writing often becomes much stronger. Tang Tang's arc is a perfect example of that. The emotional stakes feel clear, the characters' motivations feel grounded, and the story becomes much more engaging because we're following a personal conflict instead of a distant political one. But this creates an interesting structural problem. Instead of blending those two approaches together, Endfield often separates them. One chapter focuses on the plot, another chapter focuses on the characters, but rarely do both elements feel equally important at the same time. And when that happens, the narrative can start to feel fragmented. You get strong character stories that don't feel like they meaningfully advance the larger conflict, and you get major plot developments that don't always feel emotionally engaging. The result is a story that sometimes feels like it's made up of two different narratives running side by side, one about the characters themselves and one about the larger conflict unfolding in the background. Both parts are interesting on their own, but the connection between them doesn't always feel as strong as it should. The reason this pattern worries me is because of what it means for the main story going forward. In any long-running narrative, the central conflict is supposed to act as the backbone of the entire story. It's the thing that gives all the smaller stories their weight. Even when a chapter focuses on a specific character, the audience should still feel like the events happening in the story are part of something larger. That's what gives those character arcs additional meaning. They're not just personal stories, they're pieces of a bigger narrative. But right now, Enfield's main conflict doesn't quite feel like that yet. The antagonists are supposed to be the driving force behind many of the events happening in the world. They're the ones orchestrating things in the background. They're the ones pushing the larger plot forward. And yet, despite that role, they still feel surprisingly distant from the actual emotional core of the story. Even in this chapter where their action technically triggered the entire conflict, their presence barely registered in the moment. The emotional weight of the story comes almost entirely from Tang Tang and her relationship with her brother. The antagonists simply exist as a background mechanism that allowed that tragedy to happen. And when the central antagonists start to feel more like background mechanism than actual characters, the stakes of the larger narrative begin to weaken. Because the audience isn't just following events, they're following conflicts between people, they're following motivations, personalities, ideologies, the things that make a confrontation between characters feel meaningful. But when those antagonists remain distant for too long, the story risks turning them into abstract forces rather than compelling characters. And that's a difficult position for a long-term narrative to be in, especially for a story that is supposed to unfold over many chapters and updates. Because if the main conflict doesn't feel engaging, the larger narrative can start to fade into the background. At that point, the story risks becoming a series of strong character episodes connected by a central plot that never quite feels as compelling as the stories happening around it. And that's where my concern about Enfield's storytelling really comes from. Because the game clearly has very strong character writing. Tang Tang's story proves that, so do the earlier arcs involving characters like Leviathan and Yvonne. Those stories show that the writers know how to create emotional stakes and meaningful character drama. What the story needs now is for that same level of engagement to exist within the main narrative itself. Because when the central conflict becomes just as interesting as the characters caught inside it, that's when the entire story really starts to come together. What makes this situation interesting is that Endfield clearly already has many of the pieces needed for a great story. When the story slows down and focuses on the characters themselves, the writing becomes much stronger, the emotional stakes become clearer, the conflict feels more personal, and the narrative becomes much easier to connect with. In other words, the writers clearly understand how to tell compelling character stories. That's not a problem. The challenge for Endfield right now is figuring out how to integrate those character stories into a larger narrative that feels equally engaging. Because in a long-running story like this, the main plot isn't just another element of the narrative, it's the structure that holds everything together, it's the thread that connects all the individual character arcs into something bigger. When the central thread feels strong, even smaller character stories gain additional weight. Their actions feel like they matter not only for the characters themselves, but for the direction of the world as a whole. But when that central thread feels weak or distant, the opposite can happen. The character stories remain compelling on their own, but the larger narrative around them starts to feel less important. And that's the balance Endfield still seems to be searching for. Right now, the story sometimes swings between those two extremes. You either get plot-heavy chapters that feel emotionally distant, or character-focused stories that feel slightly disconnected from the larger conflict. But the best stories usually happen when those two elements work together, when the personal struggles of the characters directly shape the direction of the larger narrative, and when the larger conflict gives those personal stories a deeper sense of meaning. The good news is that Enfield already shows signs that it can move in that direction. Tang Tang's story, despite feeling somewhat isolated, still hints at the potential of bringing those two elements together. It shows that the writers are capable of telling emotional, powerful stories inside this world. Now the question is whether the main narrative will evolve enough to support those stories in a way that feels more unified. Because if the game can find that balance, then these character stories won't just feel like great individual episodes, they'll start to feel like pieces of a much larger narrative finally coming together. But that's just my interpretation of the new chapter. What did you think about Tang Tang's story? Did it feel like an important step in Enfield's main narrative, or did it feel more like a self-contained episode inside the world? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.